Hello, my name is Vladimir Belogolovsky. I'm an architectural critic, curator based in New York City. And I have my own column on Steer, and I invited Ippolito Pestellini Laparelli to have a conversation about the Russian Pavilion. He is this year's curator. And this is going to be the main topic of our conversation. I want to ask you to introduce yourself and maybe touch on the place you play in the current context of architecture. And if you could also name a few key roles, positions, projects, breakthroughs that we may associate your name with.
So, yeah, I'm an Italian architect and curator. I'm currently based in Milan, but approximately 1.5 years ago, I have started my own agency called 2050 Plus, which is an interdisciplinary platform. Before that, for 15 years, I've been working at and for OMA in Rotterdam. And between 2014 and 2021, in fact, early 2021, I have been acting as partner at OMA, together with other 8 colleagues who are still there. 2050 Plus situates its interests between design, technology, environment, and politics. That's what are our areas of interest. We are a sort of small office still. We're kind of 16 people at the moment. Not just architects. It's a collection of diverse backgrounds. Through my time at OMA, I also work in Russia on some projects. The last one was a data center in Saratov, so not really one of the centers that you could imagine in Russia, but a super, super interesting project. In any case, what happened is that during Manifesta in Palermo, I came in contact with the VAC Foundation, and they came to me before the Architecture Biennale with a specific request. They said, we want you to curate the pavilion, but we also want you to curate the pavilion and also curate its renovation, its transformation as a building per se. And I think this was the reason why they came to me. It's because I was based in Italy. I had curatorial experience and also architectural experience, but most importantly, as you perfectly know, to do historical preservation projects in Italy carries various complications. It's very difficult to actually realize a project, and it's very difficult to deal with the local bureaucratic context, with the local governments, with the city regulations, and so on. So I guess part of that played in the decision to involve me in order to support the project, both as curator and as designer, in order to reach the deadline of the opening of the biennial.
You mentioned that you are an Italian. This is actually a very unusual role for somebody to play, not from the country that is represented for a national pavilion to be curated by a foreigner. I guess this is becoming more and more common. So the Biennale's theme is how will we live together? So this was proposed by the curator Sarkis, who curated this 17th Venice Architecture Biennale. It was actually the first time when this theme was formed in a form of a question. Could you talk about your concept and how it addresses the Biennale's main theme?
The object of the Russian Pavilion this year was the pavilion itself. The pavilion itself as an architectural body and as an institutional body. And we launched the project through this open call with the idea to work on two parallel strings, basically. On one side, the reconstruction of the architecture, on the other side, an investigation into the politics and the dynamics of cultural institutions in times of global crisis, specifically through the lens of a national pavilion within the context of an international cultural event such as the biennial. So the idea for us was to basically try to understand in which way cultural institutions could actually be promoters or active agents for engagement, both through their spaces, both through their activities, in which way they would be able to actually to open up in a very inclusive way to multiple forms of knowledge and multiple forms of audiences, and actually develop those tools to interfere in real world challenges, being these not just the ones normally discussed in cultural circuits, but also real effective issues, from inequalities to various forms of violence, to the climate crisis, to our relationship to technology, and so forth. Our assumption was basically that if we have to start by looking at the pavilion, we need to first understand the politics of what it means to do and to be at the biennial, and what it means the biennial now, basically in the context of a critical moment in the history of humanity. When the biennial was postponed, our project suddenly had to reshape, and we decided to migrate online. We launched this platform, and it became basically a 2 years long investigation on the same topic. But instead of being confined in the walls of the pavilion, we were able to basically stretch the project across multiple geographies, involving multiple disciplines and multiple people. And what happened is that through time, we sort of built a community around the project. That was the result of the idea of networking from the confinement of our homes during lockdown, seeking answers to the question that we wanted to pose. So Hashim Sarkis asked us a question, we answer asking new questions, basically. That was basically the idea. I didn't want to do an exhibition, and I didn't want to present a research. I wanted to basically propose a sort of work in progress, that would refuse a single disciplinary perspective, and also would refuse the format of an exhibition. So what happened online was more similar to an editorial project, a low intensity editorial project, almost like an epistolary kind of a format, where based on our prompts, people would engage into a sort of conversation around the role of institutions nowadays, which I think is still very important, because before presenting any kind of research, it's important to understand the politics of the context in which we're actually operating. And that's the first step of engagement with the questions of Hashim Sarkis. So by doing that, the project basically became a way to reflect on the pavilion, but reflect also on the biennial, reflect on its temporality, so the 2 year cycle, reflect on its scale, because obviously the presence online allowed us to dissolve the scale of the pavilion itself and to reach out as much as we could, but also dissolve the idea of a single language or a single kind of approach, because the adaptability that the platform gave us was to also answer to the same question through multiple medias and multiple kind of inputs, from filmmaking to digital environments and gaming, to text, to research, to music, and so forth. So that at the end, our project became less defined deliberately, but on the other way, much more multi-layered and holistic. And I felt that was the most important result of our work. I don't know whether the work is fully intelligible and understandable. I don't know whether we are giving exactly the right answer to Hashim's prompt. What I know is that by unlocking this process, we were somehow generators of a place of community and community exchange, although the place was not existing in the physical. And that's why we have tried to argue at the opening of the biennial that our project situates itself in this kind of gray area between the physicality of the pavilion and its reconstruction and everything that happened online and everything that the online dimension allowed to do and to be.
If you could maybe touch a little bit more on the building itself. The building is a very traditional mansion-like structure designed by a very prominent Russian architect, Alexei Shusev. It was built in 1914. It's one of the first pavilions out of, I believe, 29 pavilions in the Giardini. Only a handful of or less pavilions were built before that, such as French, British, I think Belgian, Hungarian. So maybe this is the 5th pavilion that was built there. So very traditional structure. You mentioned the word restoration, but if you actually go into the pavilion, it's no longer in a way there, right? It's a very contemporary structure. It's a total, not restoration, but transformation. If you could touch on that.
Yeah, you're completely right. This is not a philological renovation or restoration. We should also take into account that the pavilion between 1914 and last year went through various changes and iterations. So we had to basically act as reverse archaeologists. We had to basically bring back certain features which were completely canceled. Shusev designed this building with a clear intention that was very clear from the early watercolors and all the studies of the elevations that he delivered. And the intention was basically that this was an architecture that was projected to the outside, both through its windows open to the gardens, but also to the lagoon. There was a deliberate idea to project the architecture into the fragile ecosystem of Venice. This was for me revolutionary because it was a small pavilion meant to connect people, ecosystems, and built environments alike, super contemporary in a way, even providing a public terrace on the lagoon, so not facing the premise of the biennial, but really facing the outside. And if you think about the way, for example, Gregotti used to describe the biennial in the 70s, he used to say, the biennial is a machine that needs to evolve with the city and in dialogue with the city. So that starts from the way the biennial and each pavilion are actually designed, how much they engage with whatever is outside of the biennial itself. Now the biennial acts a little bit like an island. So you sort of are confronted with a border, you move through that border, and you are in the island of cultural production, which is problematic per se, if you think about it. If you think about, again, the ambition of a cultural institution to engage with the local context, and also local context doesn't mean anything today. To engage with Venice means to engage with world-scale problems in a way, from climate change to mass tourism. So going back to the pavilion, so the question that we raised through the open call was exactly this. How can you reflect on Shusev's spirit? So on the spirit that he wanted to basically, this small architecture to have. The second question that we raised, and that's an issue of, in a way, preservation and restoration. So certain features had to be brought back. The second question is that how do you turn it after 100 years, actually after 107 years, how do you transform it into a contemporary space for cultural production, which obviously has evolved dramatically in the past century. Even if when you think about the biennials itself, the art biennial was delivered some of its best works in the past year through works which were not, let's say, traditional art, if you want to really look at it like this. Anehimov won a Golden Lion with a fantastic performance in the German pavilion a few years ago. The Lithuanian pavilion won a Golden Lion with an opera, in fact. So how do you deal with this? How do you basically generate a project that can pose challenges to artists and performers alike that can really participate to the performance that the building should actually be able to enact, which is a performance that is about also the engagement in the experience of the audience in first place. So we had these two tensions in a way. So on one side, it was about revitalizing Shusev's spirit, and that was transformed, that was translated into the reopening of the windows, the reopening of the terrace, but also the restoration of the green facade, because as you know, the building originally was supposed to be green and was green because it was supposed to emerge from the trees of the gardens of the Giardini, which is what it's doing now. And on the other side, through the project, we were able to intervene by including certain almost theatrical kind of devices. So 2 floors that can appear and disappear, liberate space or close space, connect or disconnect. And that poses an immense challenge, I think, for whoever, artist or curator or architect or cultural practitioner in general, will actually deal with the pavilion. So on one side, it was about reopening up towards the context, let air and light blow in again, reestablish those connections of porosity and osmosis, and on the other side, to turn the building into a theatrical machine, which is what contemporary, I think at least, contemporary exhibition or cultural spaces should actually be able to do.
And maybe we should touch that this was, the result was, it was a result of a competition, international competition. I understand that over 100 entries were submitted, and the firm selected Casa, based in Tokyo, run by Russian Alexandra Kovalova and Japanese Kei Sato. So if you could touch on this idea of transformation, because I understand that during the life of the Biennale, the building is supposed to demonstrate its flexibility, right? And it will appear differently from time to time.
Well, yeah. So Casa, Alexander and Kay won the competition by delivering a narrative. And that's a very important thing. Instead of delivering a finished project, they deliver a narrative that was able to give the right interpretation to what I think we were all expecting. So they entered really into, through their beautiful drawings, into the spirit of what we were kind of looking for. So I think it's the team above the 100 or over 100 that participated that they had on one side the most delicate approach. On the other, they understood that this project was about care for the pavilion, but care also for all the surroundings and all the agents populating those surroundings, humans or non-humans, that are actually part of the architecture. So that's the reason why they won. I think it's very important that they are not a fully Russian team. Alexandra belongs, as you perfectly know, to a generation of Russians that have been studying and working across the world, that have been educated in Russia, but they're kind of mixing their education with various other schools and approaches. I think that's really, really palpable in their proposal. They have the rigor of Russian architects, and at the same time, they have the sort of subtle and gentleness of certain Japanese attitudes. It's beautiful that they won because, you know, symbolically, the Russian pavilion is also next to the Japanese pavilion. We have also addressed this separation, non-separation between the two national participations by engaging with the wall that separates one and the other. But I think that also touches upon your question about me being a foreign curator. Sometimes, and I know many fellow curators who have been curating countries not of their own origins or roots, that sometimes it's also maybe interesting to bring an internal, external perspectives. My experience of Russia, which is long-term, been in Moscow many, many times, in Russia many, many times, it's obviously the one of a foreigner. So I'm participating to certain things, but I also have a critical distance. I think Alexander and Kay mixes also this attitude in their presence and in their work. And it's beautiful because in a way, cultural production is transnational. And it's very difficult to understand the physical structure of the biennial with the national pavilions under the current circumstances, under the current flows of, let's say, cultural practitioners around the world. So the selection process was very complicated. It took quite a while, and with a larger committee of people that I was part of, together with the commissioner. And finally they won. And this became basically a very funny three countries kind of collaborations between Japan, Russia, and Italy, kind of triangulating for 1 year through the struggle of the pandemic to make this project work. So symbolically, I think the pavilion itself represents also the struggle that the whole biennial in general had to go through in order to achieve its opening. What I think is important is that both the project that happened online and both the reconstruction project are not specific to this edition. They are long-term projects. The pavilion will change, as you say. It will adapt to different kind of uses. Probably the double height will be closed. Probably the central hall will be open instead. Maybe the terrace and the outside spaces will be used in a different way. But the nice thing is that we don't know. This is a project that is meant for future biennials to be curated in different ways. So it's something that it's really projecting into the future, itself into the future. So more than concentrating all our efforts into this edition, we decided to produce a project that had a long-term, hopefully a long-term relevance.
What do you think about some of their other projects? Specifically, I want to ask you about the pavilions right next to Russian. There is a Danish pavilion, there is an American pavilion, and actually all of those pavilions together with the Russian focused on the transformation of the building itself. And it seems like the curators thought about this idea simultaneously, and maybe you could look into some of the roots of these changes. Why do you think there is this need to re-examine what an architectural exhibition is? What could be its role other than just celebrating a particular work of art or architecture? So the transformation is becoming the main topic. Is this going to become like a trend?
I was reading several things related to the topic of sustainability of exhibitions and cultural productions in general. And on one side, I think it's extremely ambitious to do projects that have really deep and spectacular spatial impacts. I think they help to deliver the message. It's always beautiful to be in an immersive kind of scenography. I think the Nordic pavilion did also something very similar, also the British in a way. The Danish pavilion was extremely fascinating for me because it was the combination of a system and scenography coming together. So it was something that had a really interesting technological relevance besides the look of it and the look and the sort of scenographic quality of it. At the same time, the question that came to my mind is, this is a temporary event. In the context that we are actually living, what is the impact of that? What is the footprint of doing an operation of that size, of that magnitude for only a few months and just forgetting about it? And how can we actually interfere in the mechanics of exhibition design in order to reduce that impact or to be more intelligent about it? That's a question that I always have on the back of my mind, that it's really like a huge dilemma, because I love to design exhibitions. We do many exhibitions, design in our office, and the mechanics and politics of how the exhibition is actually designed and assembled are part of the project itself, besides the experience that the audience has while visiting the exhibition itself. Where do the materials go? Where do they come from? How long does it take to actually bring them there? What are the tours, the travels that they have to make? So it's a bifold question, because on one side, I'm extremely attracted by those kind of operations. I feel extremely energized and excited by it. I think content needs a very effective stage to be delivered. It's not enough to read a research on a wall or to read a book. You need to be engaging with content at different levels, in different dimensions, with different materials, with different forms of tactilities. And on the other side, coming maybe from the disruption that the pandemic brought to us, the impact of that operation is always something that somehow burdens our thinking at the moment, and it should be a concern. I think it should be a really important concern in this particular historical moment. This year was a difficult year. Many countries were not able to participate. The countries that were actually able to open in May, are also the countries that are also the most important countries, the countries that can rely on a very strong logistic and financial structure. They could deliver because of the structure. Many countries can't, and therefore they were not able to actually deliver an exhibition on time, or even deliver an exhibition at all. So yeah, all these questions, again, going back to the politics of cultural institutions and how they operate, they resonate constantly. The Russian Pavilion itself is a little bit different. I think there is another trend parallel to the one that you have described. A number of pavilions were actually reconstructed lately. The Australian Pavilion was actually built from scratch. It's a beautiful piece of architecture. Many, I know, are under planning at the moment. And yeah, our project was, by all means, a long-term consolidated architectural intervention that is there to stay. I cannot say how it will be used in the future. I cannot say whether there will be even more transformation to it. I know that what we deliver is quite adaptable to many situations.
I read some of your contemplations about the new role of contemporary architect, and kind of moving away from the role of traditional role of architecture in a traditional sense. If you could touch on this transition within the profession itself, if you could look into some roots for these changes, when do you think they started to occur? It's been going on for maybe a decade, maybe a little bit longer. The architectural profession becoming more open, more multidisciplinary, collaborative, and even rejecting the idea of singular author, right? And so on. And you mentioned that you were working for a number of years with Graham Coolhouse. You were his partner. I have a feeling he has something to do with it. Some of your thoughts about this kind of transformation on a level of the whole profession.
To say that this is something very recent, I think it's not true. When you think about the Eames, for example, and all their, let's say, multimedia production, from their architecture to their design to their films, a multidisciplinary approach and attitude was absolutely present, where scales, for example, would be questioned, and where the typical scales of architecture or design would be questioned by stretching them in both directions, from the microscopic to the cosmic. That meant already addressing disciplines which just on the surface are something far from what architects are concerned with, but in fact are really important. When you think about, for example, all the radical groups that emerged from the Italian scenes in the 60s, they were less concerned with building and more with the way in which various disciplines, technological transformation, social transformations, environmental concerns would actually play a role in the architectural thinking beyond the mere act of construction. So there is a long legacy to this, and maybe we can situate this in the aftermath of World War II. But obviously, Rem emerged from that culture. He set up an office that, by looking very systematically into a certain research agenda, emancipated architecture from the notion of, or architects from the obligation of buildings. So I don't think there is, again, I don't think there is anything new, but probably the scale of the phenomenon, and also in relationship to what is happening in academia in general, is definitely emancipating architects from construction per se, and maybe shaping a new generation of what can be more widely defined special practitioners, so people that use architectural thinking, therefore special thinking, to enter domains from technology to biology to climatology to biology and so forth, where normally architects are not present. And it's absolutely necessary for architects to sit at those tables, because we can bring, obviously, our perspective without necessarily claiming the role of being the ones driving the process. We can be a voice in a network of multidisciplinary voices. And reality is super complex at the moment. There are multiple invisible forces playing on the planetary field, and it's only through the matching of multiple disciplinary perspectives that we can actually disentangle this complexity. The idea, in fact, was to understand what a tiny fragment of information, like a bit, has to do with planetary scale infrastructure, with data centers, with the politics of technological surveillance, with the policies associated to that. And to do that, you have to combine so many scales and geographies, and to make visible things which are not visible, and only if they're visible and understandable, people can access them, and people can actually try to interfere with them. I think architects can have a major role in this. But yeah, I mean, certain attitudes probably will change, and architecture as a built experience might be just one of the multiple outputs that architects can actually deliver. But you are a critic and curator, you write for magazines, and so you perfectly know that there has been a huge shift into media in the past 20 years. And when architecture has met media, things have changed dramatically. And we were able also to express more ideas through different kind of means. And I see that as an absolutely positive outcome.
Yes. Well, I agree that these are not recent changes. And in fact, these changes occur and reoccur, I guess, based on different generations. And we can go back and see how, go back and see a kind of pattern of different focuses, right? It used to be that single authorship was the focus, then social agenda was the focus, psychology was the focus, and you can see how it comes back and then goes back. So it's interesting where we're going to go from here, and
But I mean, there is an interesting moment, no? In a way. Multiple things are collapsing. Modernity is collapsing. Capitalism is collapsing, or at least it's generating such immense inequalities that it's not becoming sustainable any longer. So in all these kind of transformations, I think there is a general consensus that very interesting things can emerge. But the idea of authorship through the neoliberal paradigm has been consolidated around, the figure of star architects delivering architecture as a commodity for huge investors and abandoning our social role. I think as a form of dissent or as a form of resistance, there are so many interesting experiences emerging right now. And people of my generation, but most importantly, people that I feel that are younger than me, are totally not interested in becoming what Rem has been or what people of his generation have been. It's simply not realistic even. I think the conditions are not there, but also the urgencies are completely transformed.
You were born in what year?
1980. I'm
1980.
41. Yeah.
81. So it's actually what I find is that now is the time of the people who were born in the 70s. So it goes from very early 70s to very late 70s. And I guess now...
Almost then. I'm almost there.
Yes, yes. But if you look, across the globe, the most relevant architects are now the ones who were born in that decade and maybe a little bit younger. And yes, absolutely, there is a very different attitude coming from these architects, from the sons, right, compared to their fathers and grandfathers. And let me ask you this kind of double question. Do you think national boundaries are still valid? And have you noticed any other interesting installations coming from national pavilions?
It's difficult. When we look at the populist kind of emergence around the world, it's scary to think about national identities and what they entails, ideologically speaking. On the other hand, I also don't feel comfortable in looking, at the world as one globalized, homogeneous entity, because it's absolutely not like that. Actually, globalization has generated, like we were saying, huge inequalities. So it's what we see as one single thing is actually a completely diverse collection of conditions and situations and inequalities and so on. At the same time, I feel that, for example, during the pandemic, I had this discussion with multiple people. While I totally belong to a generation who have embraced transnationalism as a condition, as a completely natural condition, through the pandemic, the role that regional or national governance have played was actually important in order to give structure to the resolution of a problem. So when that is not ideological and that is not supported by perverse ideology, perverse identitarian ideology, I think it can still obviously be really effective to solve issues, to coordinate efforts, and so on. In terms of cultural production, it's very difficult to say. I do think that it's important to recognize both dimensions, both the national and the transnational. And in our small project, the Russian Pavilion, we've tried to extend the conversation from Russia till and bringing it beyond Russia. So 70% of the participants were actually non-Russians, and they were really happy to engage in conversations because the question of institutions in Russia is super relevant, and they were able to bring their own perspective. But I'm not sure whether this will be something that will carry on also in the future. I do think that the biennial in its special construct with the national pavilions is highly outdated. And there are forms of representation which are very defined, but they're not necessarily connected to national boundaries. If we think about generations, for example, there is much more in common across generations around the world than what is in common between one country and the other, or there are cities that have more in common than countries. Milan has something more, has more in common with Berlin or Paris than with Brescia or Verona. I mean, just to make an example that is very stupid. So there are multiple ways to understand these patterns of resonance, in a way, than national borders. The problem is that the biennial is a very old machine, and it's beautiful because it's an old machine, obviously. But to change an old machine requires a long time and a lot of effort, and maybe also a very strong political will, which I'm not sure whether it's really existing. It's almost absurd. For example, I did an exhibition in Venice for a special event for UNESCO. And UNESCO is a transnational entity that doesn't need to have a national pavilion. It has a home in Venice. But we don't have a European pavilion, you know? There is sometimes a European presence, but not a European pavilion. There are not various other forms of transnational governance. There is not a Mediterranean pavilion. I mean, it's still, the structure of the biennial simply doesn't reflect the world as it operates now. I mean, that's my main thinking here. Maybe it's wrong, but I really have a struggle with that. Interesting installations. I was definitely seduced by the Danish, very appealed and interested by the Chilean pavilion, who is always able to deliver very special things. Argentina was great. The British had a good pavilion, or really engaging. And also, what I think each one of these pavilions were able to bring to the fore is that their stories was very rooted, so was very specific. And that's maybe that's still an advantage of thinking locally in a way.
Yeah, so there is a little bit of a contradiction, right, in your answer.
Absolutely. No, I mean, I'm not, I said it before, I think it's about recognizing both. It's about recognizing the fact that there are interesting stories coming from very specific contexts, but not being stuck within within only that structure.
Yeah, in a way, this national participations, national groups can be seen almost like a form of resistance, because all of a sudden it's very clear that a particular group of projects is coming from a particular region. You can see it immediately. In some countries, actually, there are very few countries where this even exists or ever existed. For example, Japanese architecture, you can trace it, right? You can see the commonalities, and the Dutch, right, and Italian, and some others. And currently, the Chinese have very distinctive features which you will not find in other regions. And then if you come to places like the United States, it's all over the place, but at the same time, you can find commonalities between architects working in Los Angeles, for example, and architects working in the Southwest. And in some cities, if you look carefully, you will find certain connections. So there are these local conversations.
Yeah, no, I agree. But like, I think it's interesting what you're raising now, because by looking at different patterns emerging from different national pavilions, you can also, of course, from the way they're addressed from a curatorial perspective, you can really read through their position on a geopolitical level. A country like the Netherlands in the past years has had multiple foreign curators and has dealt with, let's say, not necessarily Dutch-focused subjects. I mean, they did this year, but from a completely multiverse perspective. Other countries instead they maintain a much more I don't want to say it identitarian, but much more defined, locally defined kind of approach, both in their curatorial structure and both in the thematics that they want to bring and discuss on the international stage of the biennial. So it's really interesting because it positions countries at very different, let's say, moments of embracing of the current political situation.
And this has something to do with what you were saying before. CASA, the firm CASA won because they didn't offer something specific, something definitive, right? This is also a kind of trend that we are looking not for specific answers, we're looking for multiple questions. And in a way, being local is also the answer, because otherwise there is this kind of generic global
disconnect.
Yeah. It allows you to be, it allows you to have multiple visions, right? Not specific for each place, but all together they bring this kind of diversity, right?
Yeah, I think it's maybe a way to formulate this is to try to reconcile the global with the local, knowing, of course, that there are patterns which are common to all the world, or problems which are shared by all the world. Think about climate change, obviously, but the way these are unfolding locally, of course, they have different kind of specificities and different kind of answers. So it's not about embracing one model or the other, but just kind of navigating this tension and allowing it to be, or allowing the tension to actually unfold.
So going back to this current question by Sarkis, how will we live together? Which is, happens to be extremely relevant this year, even though it was posed last year. And then if we just go back a few biennales before that, there was Free Space by Grafton Architects in 2018, Reporting from the Front by Aravena in 2016, Fundamentals by Koolhaas in 2014, 2012 Common Ground by Chipperfield, 2010 kind of similar to
Sejima, yeah.
People Meet in Architecture by Sejima, and then by Betsky 2008 Architecture Beyond Building. So what, in your opinion, are some of the most urgent and relevant questions that architects are facing today, and maybe something that would be a good theme for the next time?
I think it's obvious to everyone that we live in a situation in which everything is entangled. It's difficult to isolate a problem from the rest. When you look, for example, at the various consequences and reasons for climate change, multiple things are connected and multiple outputs are actually related to that. Environmental injustice, inequalities, resource extraction, which is also labor extractions and so on. I think climate as a whole, as a conundrum of all these tensions, is the challenge that we all face. I don't think there is anything new in what I'm saying, but it needs to stay on the agenda. That's the problematic thing. It needs to stay on the agenda. As much as it might be unthinkable to do 3 or 4 biennials on the same topic, there are so many point of views that can be addressed that can make it really, really relevant and specific. I think Sarkis was really courageous in unlocking through this biennial also the various other forms that architects can actually take, especially in these exhibitions. Not necessarily the national pavilions, but also the national pavilions, because research and academia played a really big role in showing the level of interference and the level of agency that architects can have in this ultra-compromised situation. And also by showing that, it showed also the urgency of the question. So I agreed with him when the pandemic came to the world stage. many people were asking him, okay, but are you going to change your biennial? Are you going to change the participants? And he said no, because of course the pandemic was the confirmation that, you know, we are facing one of the most urgent moments in human history, and all of the things that he wanted to discuss were very, very relevant before the pandemic. And the pandemic was just a way to confirm how super important these things are. There is, anyway, within this discourse, something that for me is really challenging at the moment, and it's also being represented partially as the beginning of a chapter of investigation that we also carried out at the Royal College of Arts. That is the role of digital environments. And by digital environments, I don't necessarily mean social media and interfaces like this, like Zoom, but I mean really the world of gaming. If you think that today 4 billion people call themselves gamers or regular gamers, that is opening up unprecedented possibilities for architects to interfere and to really have an agency in the digital world that we access every day. And in the way this can become testing grounds for other forms of social or ecological realities. And it's something that I have multiple discussions about this, something that architects are really looking a little bit with suspect, because it doesn't really deal with the material world as we know it, but it deals with a world that is very populated at the moment. And I don't have a title for next year, man, or a question.